Welcome to a rapid-fire introduction to the bishop's opening. An easy system for you to master, but a nightmare for your opponents to handle. This opening begins when you develop your bishop early, placing it on a powerful square as your second move. This opening throws your opponent off their usual preparation. Most players expect you to bring out your king's knight early, which leads to well-known classical lines. But instead, you surprise them by developing your king's bishop on the second move, targeting a sensitive square in their position. This small deviation introduces several tactical traps they may not be ready for. In most cases, your opponent will continue with a natural move, developing their knight to attack your central pawn. But here's where you flip the script. You respond with pawn to d4, striking back at the center and immediately creating tension. For someone who hasn't studied this opening deeply, the pressure can become overwhelming fast. Typically, your opponent might capture your central pawn or try to defend their own pawn by bringing out another knight. We'll break down each of these possibilities and go over some of the common questions about the bishop's opening. Let's begin with the most natural response. Your opponent follows through with their original idea, brings out the knight, attacks your pawn, and decides to capture it, taking the pawn on a 5. At this point, their position becomes fragile. If they try to continue developing their other knight now, they walk right into danger. This is where the bishop's opening shines. You sacrifice your bishop with a stunning check, a thematic tactic in this line. Once the king is forced to move, you bring your queen out with tempo. On the very next move, you recover your material and leave their king exposed in the center, unable to castle for the rest of the game. As the game progresses, you begin to take control, and many of your opponents will start to hesitate. At this point, some will pause and then confidently push their pawn to d5. For a moment, they'll feel satisfied, thinking they've reinforced their knight and restricted your bishop's activity at the same time. However, what they don't realize is that after you capture the pawn with your bishop takes d5, they're already heading straight into a tactical disaster. The bishop they assumed was hanging is actually protected, so they can't recapture it without losing material. Now, they must also deal with the knight sitting on a 4, which is suddenly under attack. If they try to retreat that knight, they walk into another deadly tactic. Bishop takes f7 check. But this time, the idea is not just to check the king, but to lure it forward and then capture the queen on d8. Even if black tries to defend instead of retreating the knight, it doesn't help much. After you play bishop to g5, the pressure only builds, and you're still poised to win material. In fact, the most commonly played move by black in this position is bishop to c5, trying to create a double attack on your f2 square. But what seems like a powerful threat is met by your even stronger response, a triple counterattack that completely overwhelms them and leaves your position dominant. At this stage, your main threat is queen takes f7, delivering checkmate in a single move. On top of that, the knight on e4 is under direct attack, but the knight can't retreat because doing so would leave the bishop on c5 undefended and ready to be captured. In desperation, black might try an in-between move, bishop takes f2 check. However, once you calmly move your king out of danger, all of their original problems still remain. They must now find a way to stop the checkmate threat, and once they do, you simply capture the knight on a 4. Now the bishop is also hanging, and black is rapidly losing control. The critical issue for black is not just being down material at this point, but the fact that they remain under relentless pressure. You can easily keep up the momentum, bringing your bishop into the game, developing your other knight, or even aiming at vulnerable pawns. Your pieces have more freedom, and it's much easier for you to coordinate your forces. Interestingly, the most common response from black here is to play pawn to c6, possibly trying to prepare for some kind of counterplay. But this move does little to change the dynamics of the position. You can continue with bishop to d3, a move that starts one of my favorite lines in the entire bishop's opening. Once again, you threaten checkmate, and force black to respond immediately. Now you continue with bishop to g5, putting direct pressure on the queen. The queen must move, but right after, you play bishop to f6, setting up a deadly mating net. The idea is simple. Reroute your queen to the g7 square, and checkmate is inevitable within a few moves. Black may try to follow their original plan by pushing pawn to d5, but it does nothing to stop your plan. You calmly bring your queen to h4, once again threatening checkmate. In a panic, your opponent might attempt to block your attack, but then you go all in. You unleash your full attacking force and grab the pawn on h5 without hesitation. Now things get fascinating. After you bring your knight to g5, your queen is under heavy fire, but it doesn't matter. Even though it's black's move and they can see the incoming checkmate, they are helpless to prevent it. They know what's coming, but they have no defense. So far, we've explored what happens if black captures one of your central pawns. Next, we'll look at the other main capture, which is even more popular. But before that, let's cover a common scenario many of you have asked about, when your opponent plays a suboptimal move. These less precise responses can still be dangerous if you're not sure how to handle them. For example, suppose black plays knight to c6, just trying to hold on to their central pawn. It might seem solid, but in this case, you should not capture the pawn. It would just help black develop their knight to a strong central square. Instead, you play pawn to d5. This move shuts down black's idea completely, gaining space and forcing their knight to retreat. If they try to be bold with knight to d4, you respond with pawn to c3. Suddenly, the active knight is trapped and easily captured. To show you how powerful this setup can be, here's a quick game that perfectly illustrates the attacking potential of the bishop's opening and how your bishop can become a deadly weapon. This game was played in a national opening tournament in Las Vegas. The player with the white pieces had a rating of around 2,200, and their opponent was rated close to 2,100. Let's dive in and see how the attack unfolded. Black plays pawn to c6, preparing to challenge the center. White develops the knight to f3, and after black pushes pawn to d5, white calmly retreats the bishop. Black tries bishop to b4 check, then retreats to d6 to defend the central pawn. White plays knight to c3, quietly increasing pressure. Black captures the central pawn, expecting a recapture, but instead, white plays knight to g5, aiming at the weak f7 square. After black castles, white finally recaptures the pawn on e4. Now white's pieces are swarming toward black's position. Black tries bishop to a7 for defense, but after a trade, white supports the knight with a pawn. Queen to a7 follows, trying to reinforce, but white responds with queen to h5, threatening checkmate and leaving black in serious trouble. Black exchanged on g5, opening the h-file. To defend the king, black played bishop to f5. White then castled queenside, and black responded with pawn to a5, aiming for counterplay. In the actual game, white played pawn to a3 and eventually won, but missed a brilliant tactical finish. Instead, white could have played pawn to g4, targeting the bishop. It seems black could reply with bishop to g6, gaining tempo, and then push a 4. But white had a stunning response. White could sacrifice the queen with queen takes h6. Black can't recapture with the f-pawn due to the pin, so they must take with h7 pawn. Then white doubles rooks on the h-file and checkmates, unstoppable. This entire tactic works because the f7 pawn is pinned by the light-squared bishop. Our long-range bishop plays a vital role. Even from a distance, it pins the f7 pawn. Without it, black could simply play pawn to f6 and escape through that square. But now, no matter what move black tries, you go rook to h1 and then rook to h8. Checkmate. In most beginner to intermediate games, black often captures the pawn on d4 early. At this point, don't rush to recapture. Doing so lets black develop with tempo. Instead, play knight to f3, developing a piece and keeping the pressure. If black gets greedy and captures the pawn on e4, thinking they'll follow with pawn to d5, you play queen takes d4. Now they can't play knight to c6 as usual, because they must defend their knight on e4. They'll usually retreat the knight to either f6 or d6. Let's look at knight to d6 first, which also hits your bishop. Just ignore the pressure and castle. After knight to c6, it seems like both knights are attacking, and you'll have to move your queen or bishop. But here's the twist. Rook to a 1 check. Black is forced to block, and now queen takes g7 is possible. There's no bishop on f8 anymore, so the queen hits the rook. The rook must move, but after bishop to h6, black is completely lost. Even if they grab your light-squared bishop, the one that started it all, you'll have the final say. You finish with a checkmate.